players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Gadok-Teeg, Thoughtseize, Swords to Plowshares, and many others, battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is sponsored by Cardboard Live and TheEpicStorm.com.
Welcome to episode 8 of the Eternal Glory Podcast.com. My name is Anurag Das, and I'm here today with Bryant Cook and Wilson Hunter. What it do?
Why did you say .com?
That's funny.
Is it?
.com.
It's like MTGTheEpicStorm.com, right? Like it's one big name. It's not just MTG The Epic Storm.
.com.
Exactly. So how are you guys doing?
Doing pretty well.
Happy Monday.
How are you?
I am exhausted. So just a real life update, because we do those. I'm actually moving to a new apartment this week, and I most certainly did procrastinate the packing process, and now I've got way too much to pack and way too little time, and I've basically got like a day to pack my entire apartment, including my gigantic like PC setup, which kind of scares me because there's just like so much stuff in here. But yeah, that's
you moved like 2 or 3 months ago. You're just an apartment hopper.
It was more like a year ago, but yeah. The truth is like when I moved to San Diego a year ago, like I didn't really do a good job searching for an apartment, and now I have found a better apartment to live in. So that's where I'm going to be. Wilson, when you were asking why earlier today, now you know.
I hope Honey likes the new apartment and you have the Honey seal of approval.
Oh yeah, we also submitted an application to get a new dog. It's very exciting.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
What is the application? What, some sort of rescue adoption thing or something?
Yeah.
Or what?
Yeah. It's just like whatever their criteria is.
What kind of dog?
They're very like thorough about making sure the dogs get good homes and things like that. So, woohoo!
What kind of doggo?
What kind of dogs? What's the? It's like It's a Saluki. It's a Saluki and Australian Shepherd mix.
What on earth does that creature look like?
Very elegant, very graceful. Okay, do you know what a greyhound looks like?
Yes.
Okay, so greyhounds are supposed to be the fastest dogs, just alive. The
I thought that was a
Saluki,
whippet. Is it a greyhound?
I don't actually know what a whippet is, but a Saluki is like the marathon runner of dogs. So it's got a very similar like body structure. But anyways, we digress. Wilson, how you doing, Bryant?
Can we just talk about dogs?
What's up?
Why can't we just talk about dogs?
Well, I mean, yeah, we can. I'm down. You know more than anyone else. I'm down.
Wilson has a dog that he never talks about.
There are two types of texturing for the skin of a Saluki. Ready? The more common kind is like the feathery type, with the hair is like a little bit longer, and then you also have the smooth type, which is just like, well, not very feathery, I guess. You could Google the images if you're very, very interested, but you know.
I just found it. So the whippet is actually significantly slower than the greyhound. You're right. The greyhound is the fastest dog. It is 2 miles per hour faster than the Saluki's average speed.
Yeah, but the Saluki is built for endurance, not for like short bursts of running. So
the more you know.
Yeah, the more you know. So yeah,
it actually does look. It looks pretty beautiful.
I know. Yeah, they're very good. Oh. They are also one of the oldest breeds of dogs to exist, and I think they're from like Egypt. They originate from Egypt or something like that. Their origin is in Egypt. There we go.
Neat.
Yeah, I'm excited. Mom's especially excited. So, yeah. So, Bryant, what about you? What's going on in your life? I heard there's like an event coming up in Syracuse.
There is at From the Vault Games in Syracuse, as Anurag mentioned. It's a Legacy 2 to 2.5K. It's July 13th, $40 entry. In order to hit the extra 500, we need to hit 50 players. Unfortunately, last time, there's only 35 people that showed up for a 2K. So it's pretty good value. If you're in the upstate New York area region, it's a pretty easy drive. Syracuse is located on the Thruway. and it's actually in the crosshairs between the Thruway and Route 81, so it's pretty easy to get to. It's part of the reason that Star City Games comes here. So if you're in driving distance, it's great value. Come to Syracuse, New York, and hang out with me.
I like that Bryant is sort of like advertising to donate his money to more competitive players. Cough, cough. Okay, no shade, no shade. Bryant's a very good Magic player.
Wow, that was aggressive.
That
It's like something I would say. Geez.
yeah,
It is,
yeah,
yeah.
We all got to take turns, if you know what I mean. But Wilson, happy belated birthday. How old are
Thank
you
you
now?
so much. I don't know if we have enough episodes to unveil that information yet.
I see.
On the show.
We gotta wait for that like special subscriber giveaway. Once we hit like $500 in donations, we'll reveal Wilson's birthday kind of deal. I'm down.
Or if we set up a Patreon, that's like a Patreon platinum tier or something.
That's kind of funny. But all right, happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
What we have released so far is that Wilson has 3 children. So listeners of the cast, why don't you put in the comments how old you think Wilson is? I'm very curious to see what you guys think. But we did make a Twitter thread for Wilson's birthday to celebrate, and we got a lot of valuable feedback. What was the top comment that you enjoyed the most, birthday boy? And you have to read it with the appropriate accent too.
What's the? Oh, I can't do it.
No,
I can't do it. I'm pretty bad at that. It also could offend some of our favorite listeners in the world. So the top comment was, I guess here's the question, and I wasn't part of this at all. I saw this, and yeah. So I think Bryant posed this. What's your favorite thing about our bald podcaster? Yeah, that's what it says. The top comment, his genuine excitement followed by a gleeful and childlike laugh when Anurag messes something up. And that's from Callum Smith. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I am giggly and gleeful very often on this show, given the premises of my glee.
I like that. I like that I make you happy, Wilson, and I'll take that.
So, Anurag, I was going to ask you, I know that you've also been testing a lot of Modern Horizons. How have Force of Negation and Prismatic Vista been?
They have both been phenomenal. I mean, obviously testing is in like the preliminary stage, but I definitely think Force of Negation and Prismatic Vista will hit Legacy. I don't know exactly how the format will evolve, but I do feel like they are easy inclusions in the Miracles shell. So
I did notice that this week in the Legacy Challenge results, you were not running Counterbalance, something that I might have mentioned in the last episode. Instead, that's where you were slotting in your 2 copies of Force of Negation.
Yeah, that was a pretty easy one for... Actually, no, the Vendilion Cliques were replacing the Counterbalance, but whatever, that's not important. I do think... I thought about it a little bit after you mentioned it, and I was like, maybe Mr. Cookie's got a point here. Although I will probably revisit the card, because I just came up with some new, fresh ideas that you can catch up on www.twitch.tv/LC104. Oh my God, sorry.
I did notice something I really liked, and I didn't compliment you on stream because I don't like giving you compliments, but you were running a list with 4 Narset, and instead of Snapcasters, you were running... I'm going to blank out the name. Yeah, mission briefings. And I thought that was a smart change based on the texture of your list.
Yeah. I got to try everything. Although the blue in mission briefing is like very uncastable when you're playing the basic mountain. So
I also saw that. I probably wouldn't have been playing the mountain main.
But then, yeah. So, and then there was another card for the Epic Storm, right? How has Echo of Eons been?
So the card itself has opened up a lot of new lines, and even tonight I played in a local where there was 4 times in 4 rounds where I was like, oh, I really wish that Echo was in my sideboard instead of whatever card I was playing because it's not legal yet. So it's been fine. My win rate hasn't been very good recently. I've been hovering around 50%, but I feel like that's more of I don't think Storm is well positioned at the moment, and it doesn't have anything to do with Echo of Aeons because I've only lost 1 game that I've resolved it. I've been winning a lot when I cast it, but I'm a little low on Storm at the moment.
Okay. Well, we can get into that later in the episode, but let's just dive in. As always, we start with feedback from the last episode and covering some donations. I'd like to say thank you to, once again, Dick Fisher, who has donated for the second time. We've got Daniel Rude, and we have Sage McLaughlin with the $50 donation. That juicy money. Sage, thank you so much. We're going to throw this money back into making the production better, as always. We really, really appreciate all support, and for anyone else who is interested in, boosting up the next episode of the podcast, www.theeternalglorypodcast.com. Bryant has some sick, visual, implementation, whatever. It's a beautiful website. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's a beautiful website, and a lot of effort has gone into it. Would you say thousands of hours? Millions of hours. So honestly, that's where all the effort goes into, and also here. So thank you, and let's get into the feedback. So all right, and I'm gonna say the username wrong here, but Dougs, Dougees.
That's how I say it.
I say Dougies.
I know this individual is based out of, I think, Australia, right? Because I always see them streaming at Australian times, but
I think that Dukes is probably in our top 5 fans of the podcast. He comments on everything. He replies. He listens. Great dude.
Doesn't he have like a website like the Green Sun Zenith or something like that? We talked about it in one of the episodes.
We can't mention his website in every single podcast. Let's skip by that one.
But it's a really good website. So I'm just putting that out there, Maverick fans and, Night of the Reliquary homies. Anyways, so what Dukes is saying is, I love that insight from Bryant regarding winning through counterbalance being a little easier, not that the mana curve of miracles increasing due to Narset. It's an interaction you don't really think of until it's put in front of you. 3/4 wins against counterbalance and storm seems very good. And he also makes a comment about how he enjoys this type of insight. So these are like the nuances in Legacy that we like talking about. I think
3 out of 4. So he's saying that he played against counterbalance, 4 times? Or you did, Brian. Is that right? 4 times? And you won 3 times?
Yeah, after a counterbalance had resolved in the last local that I played in, I won 3 out of the 4 times because my opponent kept on revealing higher converted mana cost items.
Okay. Yeah. I've actually run into that issue as well. So that's why, like you mentioned, Bryant, that I had sort of just cut the counterbalances for the challenge. Hopefully Force of Negation makes it easier to play counterbalance again. We'll see how that works out. But
isn't that another 3 though?
It is another 3, but the idea is that, you're less reliant on counterbalance having to flip the right card at the right time because you'll have more just like cancels / Force of Wills.
Love playing cancel.
Yeah. Oh my God. Can I tell you how excited I am? The cancel mode for Force of Negation has come up so many times. I have hardcast Force of Negation at least 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And I've also just been flashing it back with Snapcaster Mage. So I'm just like dabbing right now infinitely left and right. But that Force of Negation, it's like A+. Like high tier restaurants from the Disney movie Ratatouille. So I don't know. Anyways. So yeah, Dukes was also mentioning like other interactions that we didn't discuss per se, but like when we were talking about the new Modern Horizons card, like Daze and Fiery Islet, like the blue red Horizon canopy that we were saying would see play in blue red Delver decks. That's sort of like a weird interaction. Although the counterpoint is like it also untaps under choke, and you could go on and on and on about all the cool things.
I actually did have an instance in the Legacy Challenge this week where my opponent had double Daze, but their mana base was Volcanic and Fiery Islet.
Ooh.
So
did they end up hard casting one of the Dazes and then bouncing the island?
They died.
They died? Yes.
I didn't win a whole lot, but I won that one.
Okay. I'm sorry, but I'm not really sorry, but like Delver has just been kicking my ass lately, okay? Blue-red Delver specifically. So hearing that the deck is not, hearing that it's whatever. It's bad manners to be happy that a deck is losing, but I'm happy, okay? Let me have this moment. But yeah, it looks like the next piece
I would like
of
to read
feedback,
this one.
Go for it.
More Wilson metaphors, please, from Not a Prisoner on Reddit.
What is this in the show notes? So the listeners out there, we have these show notes, and there's a lot of spicy little fun little trolls scattered throughout. Because somebody here, I don't know if it was Bryant this time, gets bored, and it's fun to come across these things. It's sort of like the Where's Waldo of recording a podcast.
Yeah, we keep each other on our toes. Is that?
But I do.
Correct?
We wait a second. I'm trying to envision that we keep each other on each other's toes. Like,
that sounds a lot better.
Well, no, I'm not trying to make it sound. I'm just trying to envision, like, am I keeping you? I don't know. Trying to physically envision what that would be.
It sounds a little clunkier, like my Miracles deck, but that's neither here nor there.
Jeez, dude, you can't give yourself zingers like that. But I do have to say, I appreciate this comment. It's honestly, I probably put the most preparation work into coming up with metaphors, like out of everything that it takes to do a podcast. And I'm never sure if it affects anybody, because you never know. I mean, people comment on your Magic content. They comment on your pinball content, and I just really appreciate this. So thank you.
Actually, we were supposed to record last night, but Wilson was just super, super stressed out because he wasn't ready with his metaphors for this episode. So I'm just going to dial it up to 11 and raise your expectations. Wilson is ready to perform today. So anyways, next piece of feedback is from Perry and Riposte. I'm on the other side of the last episode debate. This is regarding episode 6. I really enjoyed the branching out and found the content interesting. It wouldn't have been content that I would have gone out of my way to listen to, but since it was from you guys, and came across my desk, I got the content that I probably wouldn't have gotten normally. I enjoyed this podcast all around. Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's sweet that you enjoy us for who we are. That means that I feel like I could ramble a little bit more often, you know what I mean? But
is it Perry Andre Post?
No, it's like Perry and Riposte, like it's a fencing thing. I don't know. Well, I just look in League of Legends. There's a character. Her name is Fiora, and she's got like some moves, and one of them is Riposte, and so that's why we can ask Jarvis. Jarvis is a fencing scholar.
You think that would be different capitalization then, rather than just the P up front?
Or it could have just been like an iPhone, like auto capitalizing. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Who knows?
Isn't that spelled differently? Riposte is spelled R-I. I just thought it was a repost because we're on Reddit and people repost things, but I don't know.
Okay, maybe I tried to be too cool, and now I'm sinking in this shit.
We're losing our customer confidence. Thanks, Honor.
And Wilson is just gleefully smiling right now.
No, I really have no idea. I don't know. I'm just maybe it's both, right? Like it's just a clever handle.
That's kind of cool, actually. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Wait. Maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
Touché. Touché, Perry.
Oh, wow, jeez. That was the most clever thing you've done, Anurag. That was good. Okay.
So the next comment by Ryan, a.k.a. Burglar Baggins on Twitter. We in the Maverick group are interested in hearing more about Wilson's recent list. And thank you for a most triumphant podcast. You three are a peach.
Singular.
Interesting.
Together we make a singular peach, which I do appreciate.
Is this like the peach emoji? Like, the peach emoji, Dad?
Let's keep it PG-13 on our.
Are you hip and savvy, Mr. Hunter? You've got 3 kids. You're in the dad zone now. You know what I mean? I don't know if you get all these like references.
Goodness. Okay, so let's address this question. To be honest, I turned a little bit pink. I went back into my chair. I got a little bit, nervous about this because these are the Maverick pros asking me, who just spent some random time theorizing as I was like juggling an infant and a wild child bouncing off of me, and wanted to play some of this new Snake and Maverick. So I don't know how to answer this here. I didn't post my list. I think that we could maybe go into more detail. I have played a decent amount of Maverick in my life, just not a ton recently. And I did recently update my collection to have enough Maverick cards to play this in an event if I wanted to. But I just can't claim to even really know what I'm talking about at all. Now, I will say that my theoretical lists that I've been brewing include Palace Jailer. One of them included multiple Palace Jailers. And in general, I like to trim down on Stoneforges a little bit. I don't even really know what's standard right now, but I think Batterskull is pretty bad in Maverick 75, just the way that sometimes that ends up playing out. So my lists usually have 2 Stoneforges max with utility equipment like the Jete and the sword. Sometimes that gives you a couple extra slots. But all that being said, yeah, I need to tune and tweak a little more and maybe get to the point where I can actually test this deck before what I say matters at all.
That's fair. I do think testing deck lists out, testing cards out, certainly helps you get a better idea of how good and bad they are, especially in certain matchups. Cough, cough, Storm versus Grixis Delver, Pernicious Deed. Bad reference. Okay, cool. And then lastly,
do you want to tell the audience what you're talking about?
Absolutely not. We're gonna move on.
Right. Okay, we'll save this one for a rainy day. Let's continue.
Yeah. All right. So, are we ready to dive into section 1?
No, there's one more comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. I totally missed it. What's the comment?
So Lewis CBR, one of our favorite listeners of the show, left a very long and detailed response on our Reddit thread. And I just wanted to acknowledge it and say that we appreciate the amount of time that he puts into listening to our show and thinking about our show. And we really appreciate the response on the Reddit thread. So thank you, Lewis.
For real, though, everybody listening, your comments mean more to us than you know. We love you all. Okay, awesome, excellent. So the first topic of the day, and honestly, this one is going to tear the Legacy community apart. I know it. I can tell already. We're going to get so much hate for this. Well, not me, because I'm on the right side. But section 1 has been titled, Dreadhorde Arcanist Still Sucks. Wow.
I like how still is in here, too.
Wow.
You're welcome.
All right, so I didn't make this topic. So whichever one of you two wrote this in the notes, take it away. What's your thesis?
So this is the brainchild of both myself and our bald friend Wilson Hunter. So one of the things that I keep on getting tagged in on Twitter, or someone will mention to me in a Facebook thread, is they'll tag me and be like, Dreadhorde top 4 this event. Well, did Dreadhorde top 4 that event, or did the Blue-Red Delver Shell top 4 that event? Because for the last decade, Blue-Red Delver decks, sometimes with a splash, sometimes not, have been dominating Legacy. So I can't think of a time period in the last 10 years where Blue-Red X Delver hasn't been a viable archetype. But recently, ever since we voiced our opinion on Dreadhorde Arcanist, people have been, a little bit more eager to rub it in our face. But it's a 4 of in a deck. It's a 2-mana threat that is a 1/3, so it's not exactly fast. And I think it should be compared to Dark Confidant more than anything else. And I don't think Dark Confidant or Dreadhorde Arcanist are really what you want in a tempo strategy. They slow your deck down a lot. They're not really increasing your clock, I guess, is the big thing. Like a 1/3 isn't really a threat. It's like you're playing a Baleful Strix in your aggro deck. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And in order to play Dreadhorde Arcanist, you want to be a more tap-out style deck. So you want to have cards like Thoughtseize. But Thoughtseize has tension with cards like Stifle, Spell Pierce, and then sideboard cards like Pyroblast and Flusterstorm, because you can't hold them open. But on top of that, Dreadhorde doesn't even work with those cards. So now you have to change your deck. You have to morph to be this awkward mid-range deck, when Delver decks are best at being tempo decks. So it's a little awkward. I'm just not a fan. Wilson?
I agree with everything you're saying. Obviously. Bryant's always right. No, I'm just kidding. He's not always right. But I agree with everything Bryant's saying. And to add to that, let me think about this. So, there's a lot of, what's the word? People are very excitable over this card in the community right now. I have noticed. And I think that I could probably just repeat half the things he said again, but decks win tournaments. Decks top 8 tournaments. Cards don't do that. Cards are in decks, and sometimes they help the deck do well. But I think that's an extremely important point, because this card exists in a shell that is efficient and generally competitive in the format. And so it makes sense that the deck is doing well with it. The other part that I was gonna give this card is that it is very good in a mirror match type of situation. Essentially, the one matchup where you want to slow down as the Delver deck is sometimes the mirror match. Card advantage or playing the controlling game can be decent there. But against a huge amount of the format, Delver is such a good strategy because it's a consistent and disruptive aggressive strategy. And Arcanist just doesn't really do the things that your blue-red aggressive deck really wants to be doing. Like it's doing some okay stuff. But the other problem is, yeah, I mean, I think that the Dark Confident comparison is really good. And there's really no reason to me why that card sees 0 play in Legacy, and Dreadhorde Arcanist is considered amazing. The gap to me logically has to be smaller for those two things, and maybe Dark Confidant's better than people think it is. But those cards are just so similar that I just don't really understand why they see such a wide disparity of play, you know?
I would like to say, I think that in a year, we will not be seeing Dreadhorde Arcanist in these blue-red Delver decks. I think given enough time, people will realize that it's not really what they want to be doing. I mean, it's just the latest fad. 2 months ago is Pteramander. I think if you do want to be playing a 2-drop in your Delver decks, my recommendation, while not a creature, and it's more of a sideboard card, is Winter Orb. I think Winter Orb is super well positioned at the moment. It looks like bigger decks are becoming the trend again. We're seeing a little bit more miracles in the metagame. And recently, I've seen more Grixis Control, which died out for a while, but it appears that it's back with Narset. It has another grindy engine. And I think Winter Orb is really good at punishing these decks. It plays well with your cards like Spell Pierce, Daze, Wasteland, Stifle. It's good in a tempo strategy. So my recommendation for you tempo pilots out there is add a Winter Orb or two to your sideboard. I think you will see your win percentage go right up.
You want to hear something terrifying? I played against Winter Orb twice in the challenge this past weekend. So I feel like and both of the players that I played against like performed very well. And I feel like a lot of the Delver savants are talking about this a lot more. So the fact that you're echoing this scares me a lot because Winter Orb is a very terrifying card from my perspective. But yeah, getting to Dreadhorde Arcanist in general, I just think otherwise. Like, if I have to be totally honest, right? Like, here, let's paint the picture this way. Going into the Grand Prix, Blue-Red Delver was just one of the decks to beat. It was, had a very prominent share in the metagame, and then immediately after the Grand Prix, I don't know what happened, but I just stopped seeing the deck everywhere. I don't know if that is synonymous with your data, Bryant. But now suddenly I think we're seeing Grixis Delver, or just, Blue-Red X Delver decks come back, and I have to imagine that something had to have changed that made the deck from not seeing play to, like, now everybody and their mother is playing it and it's doing well and it's performing well. And I get, Bryant, what you're saying when you're saying that, just because it performs well doesn't necessarily mean that it's the card that's doing well. But there's a reason why these Dreadhorde Arcanist decks are in the top 8 and, just like the older Pteramander only decks are not. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like Dreadhorde Arcanist is that special chemical X that is allowing these sort of Delver decks to succeed.
You agree that a lot of people are playing this deck, correct?
I'm seeing a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's not a trick question. I mean, you just said that.
I'm just genuinely thinking about whether I, but yeah, I'm seeing a lot of it. Yeah.
Right. So my point would be, this isn't a situation where there's a card, not that many people know about it. It's dominating because that card in that deck continues to do very well with a small number of people playing it. In reality, what's happening is Blue-Red Delver, which now the stock lists have this card in it generally, is an extremely popular deck. And sometimes those players are doing well, other times they are not, but tons of people are playing them. Now, my conclusion would be different than yours, which is, why do people play decks? I don't necessarily have as, what's the word for this? High of an opinion of the hive mind, I guess, to be able to adjust, to figure something out that quickly and be able to be correct about it. I think what happens a lot in Magic is, particularly this format that we know and love, is that people see stock lists of things or lists that do well, and because there's so many options available, a lot of people will replicate those cards, and it's a little bit slow to adjust a lot of the time. So in order for the hive mind mentality on Dreadhorde Arcanist to have some sort of be evidence of how great it is. I think that we would also have to believe that somehow the community at large is really correct in quickly figuring out that this card is amazing. And to me, like, it just doesn't seem like there's been enough time. It seems like opinions and people playing the decks are so dispersed. I don't know. I just think it seems like the trendy tech that currently exists in a very commonly played deck. But
Would you compare that to Teferi and Miracles?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is obviously much more played. This is definitely a mainstream choice. I think that it is. I would argue that it's better than Teferi and Miracles, simply because of what it does in the deck. Like, I mean, I know we called this "It Still Sucks," which is a little bit strong language, but it's a playable creature. Like, it's doing some things. It's decent in some matchups. It's not an unplayable card. I think Teferi is really narrow and clunky, and there's reasons why we don't see that as widespread. So maybe my long answer to your question is I do think it's a little bit better. And that's the other thing is when there's a card that is like doing enough things where it's not terrible all the time, it's hard to sometimes understand the opportunity cost of that. Like, what if you were running some sort of army in the can creature, like some hyper efficient creature that's killing your opponent quickly? Those are the kind of things you have to be thinking of. Like, what if this card was that in this given moment? Because I can definitely see situations where it probably plays out fine. Again, I think it's a card you really want in the mirror match. I can see that it probably takes over mirrors. I think it's like average in some sort of Miracles matchup. But then against the vast majority of the rest of the format, it's just so much worse than any threat you can run, in my opinion. But I've said my piece a million times. But Anurag, do you have any response to any of those points?
Yeah, I don't know. I did have... so we did compare it to Dark Confidant, so I want to briefly talk about that. So the first thing is, I will say that the fact that it is statted differently is a big reason for why the card, it's just not fair to say like, oh, it should just be Dark Confidant. Dark Confidant didn't do well. Like a 1/3 is obviously much better than a 2/1 in the format of Legacy when you've got like, effects like Liliana Last Hope or like, Forkbolt or all the -1 effects. Although,
is it? Wait a second. I don't know. Can we talk about this?
I would rather have a 2/1 in my tempo deck than a 1/3.
Yeah, like it's different. So where I totally agree with you is that we should not be making blanket comparisons. But I do want to clarify that I don't think Brian and I are making blanket comparisons at all. I just think that what we're trying to do is talk about these 2-mana creatures, which is a lot in Legacy, right? It's twice what your most efficient threat is, and they're not very powerful. I think just generally you can put that down as they're not not a lot of damage for a decent amount of mana. And they have card advantage attached to them. So these high-level similarities are there. But I agree with you. Stats make them very different. Where I push back on is, yeah, like Brian just said it. Like, I'd rather be attacking with a Goblin Piker instead of whatever a 1/3 is.
Okay, so I'm just gonna continue this thought, but also I did say Liliana the Last Hope, and while that does make Dreadhorde Arcanist a 0/2 or something, so it can't flashback spells, you still have to constantly tick up on the Arcanist. So just a random aside, I know someone might nitpick on that, but I just want to clarify that, it's still technically a little bit better against that card. Anyways, so the 2 power versus 1 power, I think is the reason that I think is not as big a deal is like, I honestly feel like the evolution of these Delver decks is there's a lot less emphasis on tempo than there used to be. Just because of the way, like, for example, the meta shaped out. For example, when Miracles was top dog, these Delver decks just could not afford to be tempo because, Terminus and top was just so powerful together, especially with the counterbalance in play, right? So I think the Delver decks have started to evolve, and then when you had the Deathrite Shaman / Young Pyromancer era, Cabal Therapy, whatnot, Gitaxian Probe, like even in that sort of situation, you never really had to overcommit because your cards were just so individually powerful, right? So you could really just afford to either A, play the tempo game, or B, grind out later on with your, weenie 1/2 that, somehow had evasion and was just really, really just that broken. So anyways, the point that I'm trying to get at is that these Delver decks are certainly not just tempo. like they used to be. And for that reason, I think the fact that, this card is a little bit more resilient matters a lot, because it gives you a lot more stake in the late game, or the mid game, even whatever, past turn 3, 4, 5. And also I want to point out that Dark Confidant is, it does technically give you a piece of card advantage, but what it does not give you that Arcanist does is card quality, right? Being able to flashback a Ponder or a Preordain is simply just much better than getting one random card off the top of your deck, right? Because you could get a card that isn't really applicable, like a Daze or like a land or something like that.
So to pause you for a quick second, interruption. So one of the things with Dreadhorde is the card has to be in your graveyard. So I understand that it's nice when you have a Preordain or a Ponder. One thing I found with Dreadhorde is it's not always there. And I know that I play a lot of combo, and that's not exactly fair because people want to hold open their cantrips, or hold open their mana, and they don't want to be casting cantrips because they might die or whatever. But I've had a number of times where my opponent has played a turn 2 Dreadhorde, and they've either just flat out died because they tapped out, and it doesn't impact the board. Which, that doesn't matter when you're comparing it to Dark Confidant, but if that was a 1-mana threat, you'd still have a mana open. Or they next turn ponder, and then they ponder again, but then they don't have anything, and now they're just attacking with the 1/3. So it's not always guaranteed card advantage.
Yeah, but that's more on the that's just the Ponder whiffing rather than the Dreadhorde Arcanist whiffing, right? Their Ponder's not finding what they want. The nuanced decision. I definitely see what you're saying, but I do think that these decks are somewhat accommodating for that, because if you look at Sam Pardee's list, he won the challenge not this week but the last week. He had 12 cantrips in his blue-red deck. You see Echo Borodin and Medvedev, they also placed very well in this week's challenge. They also had 12 cantrips, right? So that's literally more cantrips than my deck plays, and I thought my deck was the king/queen of selection. You know what I mean? And honestly, I'm kind of appalled that I see that. But yeah, I think the deck is definitely building itself. Obviously, it's just come out of the gates, right? So it's not going to have its final form. Hashtag Frieza, whatever, but it's gonna grow, evolve, and become what it needs to be. What's interesting to me, though, is that more people are erring towards Blue-Red Delver rather than Grixis Delver, and it seems like Grixis Delver has a lot of tools that are just particularly powerful, like Thoughtseize, for example, like you mentioned. So I'm wondering if that's where people will eventually go to as the meta evolves and grows and whatnot. But one thing that I wanted to address, and I remembered what I forgot, was you also get to flashback removal spells with Dreadhorde Arcanist. So airing back to the Dark Confidant comparison, the fact that you get to flashback your Chain Lightning or your Lightning Bolt is insane, because that means you're not trying to dig towards a second copy of the card. And I think there's a little bit of a difference between playing 2 copies of a removal spell, having to draw your second copy, versus having one in the graveyard to flashback. Just I don't know, that's kind of where my brain space is. Let me know what you think.
Well, I think that there's a response to all these things, even without coming to a strict conclusion of one being better than another. I mean, you just gave a situation where you have already cast one removal spell and you want another one. What about the situation where you have not cast a removal spell and you want your first removal spell? Dreadhorde Arcanist is not helping you dig to your first removal spell, right?
That's fair. Yeah, I might take a quick cop out and say deck construction sort of is designed to mitigate that. I'm just very briefly looking at the lists that are doing well recently, and I'm seeing not just 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, but I'm seeing additional copies of Chain Lightning to sort of mitigate the impact of not having the first copy. And these decks are starting to become extremely Xeroxy, redundanty, whatever you want to call it, and.
Well, they're definitely being built around this card. They're becoming more mid-rangey decks, right?
Yeah. And so you are correct. You will have to build the deck with the card in mind, because the card does, there is a fail rate with the card. And, just sort of being la-di-da, not respecting the fail rate of the card is going to leave the Blue-Red Delver player with a bad time, I imagine. So, I don't know. But that probably goes for, every card in every deck. And
I want to make 2 points. Is that okay?
It resolves.
Thank you. Oh, both of my points? Okay. So, number 1, I think that these decks seem like they're in this mode of trying to beat other fair blue mirrors, and I can understand how that deck is doing a reasonable job of that. I just think at some point when you're playing a diverse legacy meta, you start to punish yourself in deck construction for making this super cantrippy, ultimately less powerful than Miracle's blue grindy deck. You know, I mean, at some point, if your opportunity cost, if you build your deck a certain way to warp around that game plan, maybe you don't even look at your opportunity cost as how your slots for Delver. Maybe all of a sudden you're playing in the same space as some of these slower blue decks, and you're like, why aren't I just doing a better job at being a blue control deck? And I don't know. I just think I'm uncomfortable with these Delver decks that get really heavy on value and happen to have Delver. It's why I've never liked the Stoneblade Delver decks personally. I think they suffer from the same problem as I'm seeing with this. But hey, you're making a lot of good points, Anurag. The one thing I do want to say is tempo. I do totally disagree with your point about Deathrite Shaman. That was tempo central, because the whole point of Deathrite Shaman is that you are adding mana to the board by playing a threat. So when you daze, you are also still at mana parity, and you don't go back on mana from casting your free counter magic, and you have more mana to utilize your hyper efficient creatures and removal spells and your cantrips and everything else.
I think the point that I was trying to get across was less so that it was more like tempo wasn't necessarily the only game plan, rather than it being one of two very, very powerful game plans.
The reasonable part of your point is that Delver did start playing things like True Name Nemesis, which certainly plays to that. But my pushback to the overall point is that era of Delver was way more tempo focused than this Delver deck that we're talking about right now. I think it's sort of night and day. I think this Delver deck is skewing way more mid-range. I think even the scenarios you're describing where you're winning late game with Deathrite Shaman and everything, that's still like the reach element of a fairly efficient tempo strategy, which is what the Grixis Delver deck in that era did extremely well. And I personally just feel like this is very different than that.
So one counterpoint that I had that I've been waiting to say is Anurag mentioned how the tempo-centric Delver decks kind of flutter out against better mid-range decks or control decks. And I know I already mentioned it, but Winter Orb solves a lot of that. So you can make your hyper-tempo deck stay hyper-tempo and not flutter out depending on how you build it. And you don't need to try to be something that you're not in order to win those matchups, because I'm not sure how often Dreadhorde is actually winning you a matchup against Miracles. And we mentioned how they're playing 12 cantrips and how they're trying to draw more cards than Miracles. And I mentioned this, I don't know, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, when Miracles started playing AKs and Predicts. I mentioned how the deck was all air, and I think I did it in an article, but after that, people started playing cards that punish Miracles for just being an air deck, surgicaling AKs and things like that. Not that I think that's a good line, but it did do the job of getting Miracles to quit playing 37 cantrips. Because when your deck is all air, it gives your opponents time to punish you in the beginning of the game, which maybe it's a little bit easier for Delver to do that due to things like Daze and Stifle. These decks aren't playing Stifle, so I shouldn't have said that. But you have more soft permission, so Daze, Spell Pierce, things like that, where maybe you're a little bit stronger in the early game, so you can afford to play more cantrips. But I do think at some point it does come at a cost.
Yeah. This is a pretty fun topic because doing the breeze test, just putting my finger in the air here, I think that Anurag might get maybe 70% of approval from listeners on this. I think that Bryant and I have the unpopular view, but hey, I think we're going to speak our minds on this, and I think it'll be interesting to see where this ends up in 6 months to a year.
What I kind of enjoy about this was when we originally wrote this topic down, we said we were going to keep it short, and we're about like 45 minutes into this. So I think this was a great discussion that we intended to be short, and it just, we went with it.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, for people who are listening, again, just post your comments. This conversation could literally go on and on and on. Like, I've already got points to make in response to what Brian and Wilson were saying, but I mean, we might just cut it off here just so that we could... Actually, you know what? I'll just briefly mention them, and then...
He wants the last word.
I do. So regarding what Wilson is saying, he said, why are you playing Delver then? Just play like a more mid-rangey control-y deck. I just want to point out, Arkin has actually been testing that on Magic Online. He is boasting a very powerful 28-2 record. That is ridiculous. Like, I don't think I've seen stats like that. So, and he's playing just like Dreadhorde Arcanist in like a Grixis control shell. So,
Yeah.
I have an important question. Is he buying his 5th round win?
oh no. Arkin streams literally everything. You can always find what he. I'm pretty sure everything is just on his Twitch channel, so you could certainly catch that. I'll leave it there as like a open point for growth, and then.
No. Let me agree with you. Because this will be a good place to end by agreeing with you.
Yeah, take it.
I will go back to when we talked about the card as a spoiler. I specifically said that if I play this card, I would want to try it in something like a Grixis control shell rather than the Delver shells it was being played in.
Okay, yep. So full circle. I guess it's good to be consistent, and I like that a lot. Let's take a look then at the second topic. So for viewers, sorry, oh my god, I was really trying hard not to mess that one up. For listeners in the chat.
In the chat?
Of the cast. Look,
in the podcast world?
Yeah, of the podcast world. It's really hard to transition from streaming on Twitch to recording a podcast, all right? This is the mental tax, so excuse my brain lag, please, pretty please. Earlier, or maybe it was like last week, I don't remember, I was on Leaving a Legacy with Jerry, who, for some reason, I mean, I guess this is our just like bi-weekly Jerry Jabs. Can we call it? We just should have like a podcast segment called Jerry Jabs where we just like rip apart Jerry for like, I'm just kidding. No,
I think Twitter does that for us.
Cough happens on Twitter already. Cough.
I just made that joke.
Oh, well, whatever. I'm going to edit your joke out and keep mine in.
Oh my God.
Just joking. No, but so on that episode, we did talk about to somewhat like surface level discussion of the London Mulligan, right? And Jerry was certainly voicing some of his concerns, and I presented some of my points, and I wanted to take time today to sort of just really look a little bit more closely at the London Mulligan. I think there's still like a lot left to discuss, and I know we're like an hour in. I'm ready to talk for as long as I want to, or as we need to get across my thoughts. Let's take it away with maybe our initial takes on the London Mull, and we'll start with you, Brian. Hit me.
I am pro London Mulligan. In general, this has nothing to do with Legacy. This is a Magic view. I think it creates better gameplay. You have less variance overall where one player might mulligan to 5 or one player mulligans to 4 while in the finals of a Pro Tour. Just in general, you have less bad beats in certain matchups, bringing this back to Legacy. If you know that you're going to need, I don't know, maybe a turn 2 Thalia in order to win this tough matchup, you can achieve your goal at a much better rate. So that way you have better back and forth, because then the deck that might be favored against you then has to react to you. And now you have this back and forth in your games, where most of the time, if you're just mulliganing for a single card with the current Vancouver Mulligan, you're not super likely to find it. I mean, you can. It's something people do. I know that I'm an aggressive mulliganer currently, but this will reward people with good mulligan skills in the long run. And I think more skilled pilots will be the ones that enjoy the London Mulligan a little bit more, and those that are a little bit more lazy, probably not as much, but they have time to adapt to this new mulligan role.
That's completely fair. And I like that you're looking at it from the perspective of all of Magic rather than just Legacy, because I know that is what I am certainly guilty of. I basically only play one deck. I don't play Draft. I cube sometimes. Okay, you got me. But for the most part, I'm just playing Miracles, right? Grinding it day in, day out. And honestly, like my original take for the London, this is my initial take. I was terrified. I was like, it already feels so bad to just like be on the receiving end of a turn 1 Ancient Tomb Chalice or like a turn 1 Unmask Entomb Reanimate. And I was just like, the only thing that this London Mulligan is going to do is increase the percentage chance of this happening. Why, WotC, would you do something this short-sighted? And I was just like, really like, against it, dejected. I think a lot of people originally sort of shared this sentiment. I didn't really think about it from the perspective. I mean, like obviously from the perspective of Miracles, I was like, okay, it's kind of cool. Like I'll open with a Terminus. I can put it at the bottom, but certainly like the beneficial feeling of the London Mulligan was completely outclassed by the fear of these degenerate decks just becoming way more consistent. Because, like, if you think about it, right? Like, the reason that these degenerate decks are just not, like, tier 0 is because, well, they have really, really relevant fail rates. The fact that WotC would implement something to sort of take that away from those decks just didn't make sense to me. I thought it was very unhealthy. Wilson?
Okay. So you didn't give me a lot to argue with you about, because it was really your feelings, right? Is sort of what you're saying. You're not really taking a stance.
Oh, no,
Is
no.
that
I
correct?
am taking a stance. I did not think the London Mulligan was... My initial take was the London Mulligan was going to be bad for Legacy because it just made the turn 0 decks way too broken.
So, hold on. Yeah, that's your initial take to the London Mulligan as of 2 months ago. What is your current take? Do you think that is good for Legacy? Because that's what we're discussing today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. So 2 months later, I can't live without the London Mulligan. You got to feel me on this one, because I'm just like I got to when after the 3-week trial period, I logged into Moto, started a game, and it was the Vancouver Mulligan. I conceded and just stopped playing for the rest of the day because I was just like, I don't want to do this right now. I'm not ready. So very, 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 very much a fan of the London Mulligan. I mean, I could go into my experiences, but I was just like happy that I was like proven wrong, I think.
I feel like you just set me up for failure in this discussion. You wanted me to argue with you, and then you were going to say that after I argued with you. Is that correct?
No. I was honestly like, you wrote something in the show notes, and I was trying to set you up for it. But
Yeah, you're trying to be nice.
Yeah, no, okay. So in the show notes, it says under Wilson's segment, quote, "I think the positive effect of the London Mull on broken combo decks is way overstated." So Wilson, tell me what you mean by that.
Okay, so that's a specific part of my feeling. Let me. I was about to make a high level. Let me back it down to this statement. So this is going back to the original response that you had and the original community response, which is totally makes sense. I understand why I'll say we all immediately go to these combo decks and think that they will benefit the most from the Mulligan. But what I witnessed in a different format in Modern at the London Mythic Championship, which is where the Mulligan was first tried out, is that the fair decks playing relevant hate cards for these broken combo decks in Modern benefited tremendously from being able to see more cards in a matchup. And also, the interesting thing about this is people had their opponent's deck lists in this tournament, which made it even more interesting. So I think the fair decks benefited even more in those scenarios as well. So you saw people, fair decks playing main deck surgicals because they were going to see each other's deck list beforehand, and they were able to London Mull into potential surgicals. And I think the control decks benefited tremendously. So even though we're not talking about open deck lists for all of Legacy, you can extrapolate to the fact that 2/3 of a 3-game match, if you go to game 3, you're going to generally know what your opponent is playing. And I think you can apply some of that there. So, Anurag, your feelings of wanting the London Mulligan from the Miracle standpoint sort of makes sense to me that it played out that way for you, because the London Mull, just as a game theory concept, right, it just lets you see more of your deck potentially over a sample size of matches. And that allows you to generally play more Magic if you're making reasonable decisions. It lowers the number of games that are decided by variance in terms of just having bad draws and having cards that don't interact well with your opponent. And it lets you see more cards that could interact within the rules of the game against what your opponent's doing. So I think that's good for the game, which sort of goes to Bryant's, I think, general point. And also, in the big scheme of things, it benefits decks that want to interact in ways with their opponent if they're consistent decks. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of my general thought on it. Let's dive into Anurag. Looks like he has a response here to the...
Well, this may or may not be like a direct response, but I will say that regarding my current stance, I still think there's a little bit of hesitation that I have for the London Mull, and that is mostly related to the point that... Okay, so I'm just going to go back to Modern, right? Are you familiar with the Neoform deck that came up during the testing period?
Yes.
Okay, so this Neoform deck was like absurd, right? Brian, are you also familiar with this?
I am.
Okay, cool. So I think the biggest issue with this Neoform deck was that it was just a really consistent, an absurdly high win percent rate. I cannot stress this enough. Like
It was 25% on turn 2.
Yeah. Wait, what was it?
I believe the number was 25% on turn 2.
Okay, and that's pretty absurd, right? Like 1 in 4 games. People were picking up the deck with no experience at all, and they were just completely crushing with it. 3 weeks later, London Mull goes away, and LSV picks up the deck. It's like, how does this work? Is it still good? And he goes like 1-4 in the league or something like that. Like, just really bad. I think the point that I want to get across though is just this sort of Neoform effect is directly related to us having the London Mulligan, right? And in terms of legacy, I think there's so many decks that have existed in the timeline of Legacy that maybe just don't see play now because of either power level or consistency or whatever, that the London Mulligan could dramatically improve. It's just that it's not on anyone's radar because no one has played it in forever. So like, I don't know if people have like tested Hypergenesis, for example. Like that deck seems like super scary with the London Mulligan. Maybe not like a turn 0 win rate, but you get what I'm trying to say here? It's just like this Neoform effect could transform a deck that previously had no game in the Legacy format to a deck that has all game in the Legacy format. I don't know.
Yeah. So what I was going to say here is that I don't totally disagree with what you're saying. I think that the effect of the London Mole on the deck Neoform in Modern of what you were describing is overstated a bit. I do think it checks all of the boxes of being the exact deck and environment where London Mole plays maximum effect in this situation that the London Mulligan is probably ever going to play. One reason for this is that the brokenness to interactivity level of Modern is quite different from Legacy in that you are quite rewarded for doing something that is linear and broken to the extent that you should play decks that have a smaller number of combo cards in them, which maybe it's more fail situations. What is that the term? What's the term you use, Anurag? More fail?
Like a fail rate, yeah.
A fail, yeah. So yeah, there's more of a fail rate in your opening 7 in some of these Modern decks because the reward for the brokenness is higher than Legacy. Legacy has a lot of tools available with interaction with the broken decks. It's why something like Oops All Spells doesn't just run rampant in Legacy and is more of a fringe deck, is because just to put it frankly, we have Force of Will and Friends to keep all of that in check. But also a lot of powerful turn 1 plays. Chalice of the Void thing. There's all these different axes of fighting, but it's very, very quick and really does a good job against the combo decks. So that's sort of my response to you is that, yeah, I think that the Neoform example is probably the best that exists in this world of London Mole and how it's affected. I just don't think it's necessarily applied to Legacy in the exact same way, simply because of the way the format we're dealing with. Now, this leads me into answering your other question, which has somewhere in our show notes, which is which deck, are we talking about this now? Which deck benefits the most, or is this later? Are you guys cool if I say what I think about that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so which type of deck benefits the most from London Mulligan? It would be exactly what you're saying. It's a deck that has a high enough fail rate in an opening 7, but somehow is so degenerate that high fail rate is worth it to take the risk on. And those are the decks that benefit the most. I know Bryant mentioned Painter. I'm not sure I agree with Painter. I understand what you're saying. Painter probably benefits more than the average deck with London Mole. I just don't know if I would say the most.
I wasn't saying it was the most either. I was just throwing out a hypothetical deck that could take advantage of it.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, and I think I agree with you on that because it's 2-card combo, right? So that would be probably your thinking there.
Yeah, not even 2-card combo, but a card like Red Blast could theoretically just be very good inherently, like in a certain matchup. So I think that goes back to what you were kind of saying, Wilson, right? Where like you want, or maybe this is like the second type of deck you're talking about, where cards that have like just Jundi type, really just like good cards deck kind of deal.
Yes, that is my initial point with London Mole in general in the format and how it affects it. But if the question is which combo deck could take most advantage of the London Mole, I would think it would be on the formula of high fail rate because it is so broken. And those decks are things like Oops All Spells. And I say Oops All Spells over Belcher, even though I'm not making a judgment on how good Oops All Spells actually is. But it's simply because Belcher is actually a deck that you do need a certain card density to get to the 7 mana, or in some cases 6 mana. So you can't just like turbo mull down to 4 cards. So yeah, that's just sort of my thought. Maybe, I mean, I think the Black-Red Reanimator thing is an obvious one that everybody's been saying, but because that deck is already so redundant and Hate fights it similarly, even if it is able to increase a little bit more of its turn 1 and turn 2s, that, you know, I think that the London Mold doesn't actually make Black-Red Reanimator Legacy nearly as broken as Neoform is in Modern, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the checks and balances of cards like Force of Will, and now like in the format where you have like Force of Negation as well, so sort of like double downing on the you can't get away with all this, you know, degenerate action, sort of mitigates the impacts of the London Mull benefiting all these scary turn 0 decks. One thing I will say though, and I know this is something that Wilson will. He will enjoy this. So I have had a rule in Legacy, the number one rule of Legacy, and this is something that was just crafted together during the era of House Babarag, aka when Bob and I used to live together, right? It's just you never mulligan. Rule number one about Legacy: never mulligan. You watch me on Twitch, you see some of the hands I keep. They are really, really suspect, like double Terminus hands, triple Terminus hands sometimes, where I'm just like, oh, I'll draw a Brainstorm at some point in time, and then, you know, I die on turn like 2 or 3 with my 4-card hand. But no, all right, I'm gonna throw this to you guys. Do you guys think that I am more likely to mulligan now, or I am less likely to mulligan now?
You're more likely, but that doesn't mean that you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, you're undoubtedly more likely to mulligan now. My question I posed in the show notes is, yeah, it's really like gauging your emotions.
Yeah.
And so can you give us a read?
There is something just so satisfying about putting a Terminus on the bottom of your deck. You know what I mean? Like I have been drawing these stupid hands in like the last challenge, the challenge before, and I'm just like, I have this stupid Terminus in my hand. If only it was another card that actually does it. No, there are actually so many games where I'll like die on like turn 7 because I just don't hit that Brainstorm, and I'm like, this Terminus that I opened up with has been doing actual, factual, literal nothing. And I just die with it in my hand, or I play like a 7th land drop to play a Terminus through a daze, and then it gets Spell Pierce, and I'm just like, wah kind of deal. I don't know. I, for one, enjoy mulliganing a little bit more. I am happier to mulligan emotionally.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I
know. Those
know.
are words I never thought that you would use.
Exactly.
In the same
So maybe
it's tempo negative.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's I'm a little bit red in the face because it's so strange to me, because I mean, my decks always are err on the side of like card advantage, and it's a big deal for me. And you know, mulliganing is a card disadvantage, cough cough, but also so is dying with multiple Terminus in your hand. So because you know.
I mean, in old mulligan rules, it is absolutely. I can agree that it is very frightening to mull into a 6 with any number of Terminus and no Brainstorm. It just feels horrible, you know.
So I have 3 things I would like to say.
Ooh.
Oh, I'm sorry, Anurag.
No, go ahead. Do you want me to drop a beat for you or something? Like,
no, I'm good. So the first thing would be, I think Black-Red Reanimator is the deck that benefits the most from the London Mulligan. It's a degenerate deck, very similar to Neoform, where you put a Gristlebrand into play, then you just win the game. So when you're able to mulligan down to 4 cards to achieve your goal, that makes it more worth it than most of other decks, because the loss of cards doesn't matter once I achieve my goal. So I think Black-Red Reanimator is the deck that benefits the most. That said, your opponents can also find their dedicated hate a lot more easily. But the problem with that is I don't think people are going to be playing Ley Lines of the Void and things like that. I think Black Red Reanimator is going to continue to strive in this new world, but initially there's probably going to be a little bit more hate than there was before. The second thing is, Wilson mentioned Belcher being a critical mass deck. I think Belcher is actually one of the very, very, very few cards, or very few decks in the format that's going to be able to get away with main deck Echo of Aeons as a 3 of, and then 1 in the board. Because you are an LED deck, you don't have any cost restrictions, and you can play the 4th in the board. So you can mulligan to 2 if you open up Echo of Aeons and an LED. It's just something that these decks now have available to them. So I do think Belcher got a new tool that people aren't talking about. And the final thing is, I think the people that are initially very afraid of the London Mulligan are the same people that were on Reddit saying after 12 hours of spoilers that Echo of Aeons will be the next card banned. If you've played with this card at all, you realize it's not Time Twister, but also I don't even think Time Twister is super good anymore. I know it's been talked about in Facebook chat groups and stuff like that. Like, Time Twister is obviously a very powerful card, but in the realm of what's possible in Legacy nowadays, the symmetry of it hurts so much. And don't get me wrong, I would love to play with Time Twister, but it's just not as good as people think when Gristlebrand's running rampant and Show and Tell and so many other degenerate things. It's just another one of them.
So I'm gonna put a pin on one of the points that you mentioned, specifically with regards to Black Red. I want to come bring this up later when we talk about slight spoiler, but deck building with regards to the London Mulligan. That being said, I do like some of the feedback that I'm hearing from you, so that's pretty good. Do we want to talk about the next section? I think now that we've talked about our initial impressions of the London Mulligan, I want to talk about like how the London Mulligan affects gameplay, to go a little bit deeper onto that.
Go for it.
And I think the most intuitive, let's just look at this intuitively, right? Like, Wilson, you've mentioned this, and Bryant, you've also given hints about this. It's pretty obvious, right? The London Mulligan overall will decrease variance in Magic the Gathering compared to the Vancouver Mulligan. And I mean, it's just a more generic way to mulligan, and this is something that's just like inherent to the London Mulligan. But one thing that I do want to clarify, one thing that separates, or one thing just to be aware of is, right, when I say it decreases variance, I mean that it decreases all variance, not just the sort of the variance that we, typically, the type of games that we associate with variance is where you like either mull to Oblivion, or, you mull to a hand that doesn't do too much and then you die. I'm also talking about there's a good type of variance too. So, like I'm mentioning, the bad variance is where you mulligan to Oblivion and die, you have no lands in your 7, 6, or 5. Then you're at 4 cards and you can't do anything. The good variance, though, is the type of variance that promotes that promotes diversity within a game of Magic, right? So just like a good example of this is like you're playing Aggro Loam against a Delver deck, right? And it's your turn 2, and your opponent just played a Delver on their first turn. You've got Abrupt Decay in your hand and Punishing Fire, right? So there's some sort of like calculation you need to do to decide which spell to cast, right? And there is variance just in like figuring out like which variety of removal spells you've drawn that you might be likely to draw into, and sort of doing the mathematics on that. I think that is very healthy. Decision making is, one of the critical aspects of Magic the Gathering, and seeing more of it, I think, is in general, like, I would call that a good thing. But yes, the London Mulligan actually does decrease that sort of good variance, because it promotes the idea of mulliganing a lot, right? Because you want to ship away hands that, in a specific matchup may not be good enough. You want to find a very specific, either proactive or reactive plan, depending on what your game plan is in a specific in a specific matchup, right? Like, so let's say you're playing, again, let's go back to this Aggro Loam deck, and let's say you're playing against Delver, and you see a 7-card hand that has maybe like a Dark Confidant and like a Mox Diamond, but it doesn't have any removal, right? This is like a hand that, and I don't play Aggro Loam, so I don't particularly know. Maybe I should have used Miracles as an example. It's not a hand that's necessarily bad, but it's also not necessarily good, right? So with the construct of the London Mull, maybe you're incentivized to, sorry, not the construct of the Vancouver Mull, you're incentivized to keep that kind of hand, even though it's not necessarily like the best hand you could possibly have. I think the London Mull means that you would probably be more okay with mulling that kind of average hand in favor of something that is just a lot more like linear, just like, a bunch of removal. And I don't know, do you guys kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to say here? It's just like you're mulling to something that's very, very specific, and you're more willing to mulligan to a specific thing because, well, the mulligan is just less punishing over the course of a game/match.
If I disagree with you now, it will make my previous statements look really dumb, so I think I'm going to agree with you.
Okay.
I want to make a complimentary point, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that the British people have had such a major influence on mulligans in the game of Magic. Because we had the London Mulligan, and Vancouver is essentially a British city.
Well, what about the Paris
Well, if you
mulligan?
think about it, the Paris lasted much longer.
All right, that's all I wanted to add to this conversation. But I think that you made a lot of good points on our own.
Yeah. So I guess the real question here is, well, maybe not the real question, but one question I have is like, is this trade-off worth it, right? Because on one hand, and this sort of goes back to what I was saying in the Leaving a Legacy episode, right? Jerry is afraid that all these games are going to just devolve into like the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it's like, is the cost worth it? Like, how often are you actually mulling to Oblivion versus, you actually get to play Magic, like Bryant was mentioning earlier, like it's a good feeling to mulligan to a 6 that doesn't, suck ass.
My exact words.
Yeah. My honest opinion is that I think the trade-off is very much worth it. I think the gains in consistency are probably, I want to say they don't decrease variance that much. And here's my reasoning for it. You ready? Legacy is a special format because the cards that exist in Legacy are just unique to that format. And I'm specifically talking about being able to play 4 copies of Brainstorm, 4 copies of Ponder, right? The Cantrip Cartel, as they're infamously known as. These Xerox strategies do a much, much, much stronger job at reducing good variance in Legacy than anything else. The London Mulligan simply just does not come close to the amount of damage that these cantrips do to quote good variance. Every single game, you're looking at like a 7 or 6 card hand with a blue deck that has a Ponder or a Brainstorm that can further sculpt your hand, find that piece of removal or that that answer to the counterspell the answer to the combo or whatever it might be. And I mean, it's pretty elementary when you think about why the cantrips do just a much more effective job at decreasing good variance, because these cantrips are not restricted to a one-time thing, right? The London Mull is you look at your 7-card hand, and only one time at the beginning of the match you can mulligan, right? It's not like on turn 6 you get to mulligan one more time or whatever it may be. But the Cantrip Cartel is there to last, right? You go Ponder on turn 1, Ponder on turn 2, Brainstorm on turn 5. It's just there over and over and over again. And I think the games in Legacy right now, like we're pretty vocal about this, where Legacy is just in like a really good state right now, right? Despite having all these cantrips that sort of make games repetitive. I think it's probably okay because there's no one deck that is just like inherently like so overpowered and busted that, everyone's playing that deck. Brainstorm and Ponder really aren't as strong as they used to be. And if Brainstorm and Ponder aren't even that bad, really, like the London Mulligan can't, do that much more damage to suddenly make the format just like playing rock, paper, scissors every single time.
I have a confession, and I'm not proud of this. I listened to the Leaving a Legacy episode featuring Anurag Das.
Oh, man.
And there's something in the episode that really, really bothered me. And I'm not going to say who said it, because it doesn't need to be said. But an individual said, you don't need Ponder because you can just mulligan and sculpt your perfect hand. Doesn't matter who said it. I take issue with this because I don't think they took a step back and thought non-emotionally about how games actually play out. Because if you're sculpting your perfect hand, you're now starting on 5 cards versus their 7. Or 5 cards versus their 6. And I understand that, hey, it's just a card or just 2 cards. I want to achieve my strategy. But it is not the same as the Leaving a Legacy episode compared it to already having Ponder and not needing Ponder because you have the London Mulligan. Games are longer than 1 or 2 turns on average, and this is coming from the combo guy. So keep in mind, these are long games, and even if you do Mulligan until your turn to Thalia, that comes at a cost, and your opponents are just as likely to have their disruption for you. And I think it's very important to take a step back and look at it very logically and not let your emotions dictate how you feel about the game.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a good point. I don't think you're going to magically. I mean, obviously, it's going to happen some percentage of the time where you ship a 7, look at another 7-card hand, put 1 card back, and your opponent's just dead on turn 1 or 2. But I obviously don't think that happens enough, and I feel like WotC's got enough data in the bank to also, I mean, they're not going to be like, they wouldn't have. By the way, for anyone who may not be aware, the London Mulligan is official. It is coming to all Sanctioned Magic sometime in July, I think. And I think WotC's got enough data to, just be confident in this decision. But yeah, that is certainly a good point. I want to follow up. So now that we have talked about like variance and, with relation to the London Mulligan, does this mean then that the format will speed up a little bit?
Definitely.
Yeah, my take is also, I think it does. I think the format definitely speeds up because it's simple. You just have more card quality in your opening hand than before. You get to ship away a 7 that may not necessarily, be in line with your proactive strategy to a 6 that, has that show and tell and Gristlebrand that you can play on turn 3. I mean, obviously, again, like it's not going to happen all the time, but like, you're seeing more cards on every mulligan to 6, every mulligan to 5, every mulligan to 4, which means that you can piece together your proactive strategy a lot more of the time.
Why are you assuming proactive strategy? So before I get into this, you guys, to clarify, you both think that it's going to speed up the format.
Yeah.
I finally like that I'm on the opposite stance of Wilson about something because I'm going to fucking crush him.
Woo! Wow, that's a big words coming from a test player. I'm just kidding. Tess is great.
It's TES, clown.
So first thing, you're assuming proactive strategy in your thesis here, Anurag, correct?
I definitely think proactive strategies will become faster. I kind of also want to say that reactive strategies will also be able to get closer to their lockout plans.
I mean, is a blowout game fast or slow?
Counter question. Dex playing a turn 1 Trinisphere. Is that game decided on turn 1?
Counter question. Is a hot dog a sandwich?
According to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, yes.
A resolved Trinisphere, any lopsided game is more likely to happen without the London Mole, right?
I don't agree with that.
Why is that?
So, sure, the Mulligan games are more likely to happen with the Vancouver Mulligan. But lopsided games, I'd say they're just as likely to happen with the London Mull because you have games where people are more efficient at what they're doing. So if you played it all during the testing period, you would have seen that the Dragon Stumpy decks of the time became very focused on turn 1 Trinisphere. They were playing Chromox and Simian Spirit Guide, some with even Lotus Petal, with 4 copies of Trinisphere, which is a little bit more than these decks play. So they had 4 Trinisphere and 12 Accelerants to pair with their Soul Lands just to play turn 1 Trinisphere because they know that they're going to have an easier time winning the game post Trinisphere. So there's more non-games from the prison element. Like, sure, the game's not over on turn 1, but it's effectively over.
Okay, I'm going to focus in on one part of your statement here, and that is the testing period of the London Mulligan and how people built their decks during this time gives you your conclusion of what you're saying, correct?
It is a short period. Granted, it was only 3 weeks, but it's an example of a 9-game scenario during the London Mulligan, and I think this is the trend of which will happen because it does change deck construction, which is our next topic, but you can't look at things through the same lens.
That's an example of a deck trying to Okay, there's two different points here. I will first address that part. That is a deck trying to create a non-game, but the opponent is more likely to be able to interact with that potential non-game than they were able to do before the London Mulligan. Do you agree with that?
I do.
So that would be a slight counterpoint, but my overall point, and what I wrote here in my little paragraph, is that my theory is that it's not the London Mulligan itself that affects the speed of the format. It is the perception of how the London Mulligan affects people's decks and their deck choices that will affect the speed of the format.
That's fancy.
How so?
It's like a very meta thing to say, like, ooh.
A little snooty.
Well, no. It's important. I mean, we're on a. I'm allowed to go into this much detail, right? We're on a Daggum Legacy podcast where we talk about this stuff for hours every week or two.
Can you please repeat the beginning of that sentence?
I think he said "dadgummit."
Dad blast it. So it's an important point because it's a point that also came up earlier in this episode about Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is to sort of think about metagaming and to understand why things happen in Legacy. It's really about human psychology more than anything else, because we're not playing against computers. We're not actually playing a game against people that understand the London Mulligan even close to perfectly. Many people are on opposite sides of this, right? So to figure out how it affects a metagame, we just have to figure out what people think about it. And eventually, the hive mind plays enough where it shakes out a bit in how it actually affects, how good decks are and whatnot. So my theory that I wrote down here is that I think that it will speed up the format initially, given that a lot of people will try things exactly like you're describing, Bryant, where they go more all in on decks that don't require a quantity of cards, or not about card advantage, but instead rely on a certain combination of cards, maybe one powerful card and mana, like you're describing with the Stompy deck, or two cards that create some sort of instant win in a different type of combo. I recognize that that's sort of like the level one that I think about the London Mulligan and how the community probably thinks about it, which makes sense that all of a sudden there's a lot of this sped up Legacy, right? But in the big scheme of things, I think that the London Mulligan actually creates more scenarios for playing the game of Magic. And I think that once the overemphasis on degenerate combo balances out a bit and people realize, like, yeah, okay, my Black Red Reanimator got better with this Mulligan, but not that much better. I mean, it still has all the same issues the Black Red Reanimator had and all these other things. Once people start to figure...
I will agree with that point.
Yeah, and I think that once people sort of figure this out and the metagame just calms down a bit and goes back to what it was, a similar metagame to before with the London Mulligan actually creates slower Legacy, because you're going to have more actual games to be played, because you aren't going to have these Mulligan to 5 and not have the cards you need, because your Mulligans to 5 are actually mulling to seeing 7 and hopefully not being mana screwed on your 5, right? So, yeah, I think I know it's convoluted. That's my thought on it, is the perception right now is going to make it faster. In the long term, I don't necessarily think Legacy will be a faster format because of it.
That's kind of interesting. I guess maybe the reason that I could get behind this sort of take on the London Mulligan, specifically with regard to like perception of where the format is because this will be like the very first time the format is officially, endorsed with the London Mulligan. People have no idea, for the most part, what the format's going to look like. And so it's just about what we think and what we theory craft the format to be. But I definitely think maybe months from now, or even years from now, that there will be actual factual data to sort of describe or, at least give reason to why people will play the way they do, how they mulligan the way they do.
I know this is somewhat anecdotal, but you really like the London Mulligan, and all you've been doing is playing Miracles, right? Like, you don't think that you're doing poorly because of it, correct?
I don't think it's decreased my win rate.
Okay. That's incredibly relevant to this whole discussion because you were playing quite possibly one of the slowest decks in the format, and you're not doing worse. I mean, again, this is an anecdotal point, but it goes to your experience after playing just a lot of Magic in general with this one deck. And I think if you extrapolate that experience that you're having with Miracles, I think a lot of other people are going to begin to have that experience as well. And that's sort of my theory of where the format ends up.
So we've already discussed that the London Mulligan is more beneficial to decks that don't run the Cantrip Cartel. And I think that Miracles and other control decks aren't the decks that are gaining the most from the London Mulligan. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And the reason that I think so is because if I see like a 7-card hand that has like one land and a ponder and like maybe like, some other castable cards, it's not like I would ship that unless I somehow know game 1, what I'm playing against, or game 2, like the matchup just absolutely necessitates it.
So non-control decks would be the decks that gain the most, which means that proactive decks are the decks that really gain the most from the London Mulligan, which leads back to our original point that I disagreed with Wilson on. And I think that's decks like Dragon Stompy, Black Red Reanimator. These are the decks that are proactive, that are going to get the biggest boost, and therefore they're going to dictate the metagame, at least for the foreseeable future, and that could shake out to be differently. 6 months from now, it could slow down. But I think for the initial 3 to 4 months, we're going to see the format speed up because there's going to be more decks that benefit from the London Mulligan.
I think the one part of this that I disagree with is how much you guys believe that the fast decks or the combo decks benefit more than a deck like Miracles. And I think there's some nuances in terms of why I believe that. I think that part of it is the way that a deck like Miracles is constructed. It's not just a card advantage control deck like you would see in Standard or something where you want to hit a 5-mana Planeswalker that draws a bunch of cards. There are these interactive combo elements to the deck that are incredibly affected by which cards you see in your hand. The very obvious one is Terminus in your opener without a Brainstorm. Those two cards together have a huge effect on how the game plays out. So just that specific one is heavily affected by the London Mole. But I think even more importantly than that, you get into these specific answers that you have in these legacy decks that are very, very powerful answers that benefit tremendously from London Mole. So the probably one of the best ones being Surgical Extraction. So this is the hypothetical matchup, right? Let's say Black Red Reanimator, which is hypothetically benefiting the most from the London Mole in this matchup against Miracles. What are you brought your Miracles deck with 2, maybe 3 if you decided that there was going to be a lot of Reanimator to the Surgicals in your sideboard to this tournament. All of a sudden, games 2 and 3, I think the London Mole benefits the Miracles deck in that specific matchup. And then you add Force of Negations and Force of Wills to that. I mean, there's a small number of cards that you really need to see to feel like you have a fighting shot. And if you do see them and have enough going on after that, you may be able to turn the corner. I just think that the Miracles player benefits tremendously there. And that's sort of an example of what I'm talking about, how the London Mole isn't something you get in a goldfishing void, which is our temptation to build these hyperlinear turn 1 decks is we always want to goldfish with the London Mole and think that it's benefiting us so much. The interactive stuff that was really freaking good against our decks, all of a sudden you're definitely going to see more of that. You're going to see more Surgicals if you play Black Red Reanimator in the London Mole area. And the question is your increased consistency with your combo going to overcompensate and be better than the increased consistency of seeing some hate in the format against you?
So I will agree that you are more likely to see your interaction, which leads to more game planning. I am not arguing that. So what I am willing to argue is the fact that you mentioned Surgical as your example. Miracles, unlike other control decks and other formats, doesn't play game-ending haymakers. So it doesn't play things like Rest in Peace, for example, that just completely shuts out Red-Black Reanimator. Will you agree with that? It doesn't play these huge haymakers where in Modern, they might be mulliganing for Stony Silence or Rest in Peace that actually crushes or destroys a matchup, where Miracles still then has to fight back. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, if you open up a surgical, keep in mind black-red is still just as likely to have a Chancellor or an Unmask, especially if you're mulliganing. So even if your plan to surgical a Gristlebrand or whatever you're trying to hit does work, Red-Black Reanimator is literally built to fight back against surgical because it's the best graveyard deck at beating surgical. It's literally like why the deck, I should not say literally like that, but it's why the deck has continued success on Magic Online and is a trophy deck, other than the fact that you can play it very quickly. But it's because it's so good at fighting non-dedicated hate. So it loses to cards like Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace. Like those are the cards that actually beat it. And if you're not playing those, I'd rather be in the Red-Black Reanimator side.
Okay, regardless of the conclusion, I do want to make a quick point. I agree, and I'm not trying to make the point that surgical is that good. It's more so that the turn 0 or turn 1 interaction is so important that there's enough cards in your deck that don't really do very much that you have opportunities to mulligan hands, and if you are seeing more cards when you mulligan and seeing more of that interaction, you have a better shot of winning the game. So I totally agree. Surgical isn't this like we are mulling all the way down to find the surgical, and that's all we're going to do.
I'm going to sort of like fluidly like transition because I think we are sort of overlapping into what is the last topic for the night, and that is also with regard to the London Mull's deck building, right? So one thing that I do like, or maybe the conclusion that I might ultimately settle on, I don't know if this contradicts what I said earlier, and if it does, I'm sorry, I'm a hypocrite, you got me. That is that Legacy is a very efficient format, and I think the way decks are constructed in Legacy are very, very focused on this sort of min-max concept where you try to minimize your opponent's chance at winning the game while maximizing your chance at winning the game, if that makes sense. So it's like very, very tight. That's why you don't get to play, all these very for fun cards, like maybe, for example, Venser, because sometimes you don't actually get to the point where you can, cast that kind of card, or it's like too clunky, or it's like, not, that's why you err on like Surgical Extraction over a card like Rest in Peace, because it's just like, it more efficient. It's better at doing what needs to be done. Or maybe that's goes back to what Bryant is saying, where it's just like, all right, well, now everyone's playing Surgical Extraction, so the black-red Reanimator decks sort of build themselves off of having all these infinite discard spells to interact with the cards that, are very, very, very good against them. For example, Cabal Therapy over like, Inquisition of Kozilek or Duress or whatever it might be. So this is going to go into the sort of deck building discussion. How do we think the London Mulligan affects deck building?
Well, I know that I'm personally going to shave a land from TES. Combo decks in general, they often exist in this weird ebb and flow of I want just enough to do what I need to do. And currently, a lot of us Storm players are playing one more land than we actually need just because the Delver decks exist and so many things like that. And if I'm able to comfortably mulligan down to 6, I think I'm able to get away with a land out of my deck. I said that a little awkwardly, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Okay, that's an interesting take. For me, and I know this is going to sound kind of interesting, but I play a control deck, right? And the definition of a control deck, by definition, it has to be controlling something. So my deck would probably change with the meta, and that's kind of a cop-out, but that's just how Miracles always is. With regards to the London Mull in mind, I don't think I would really change anything that dramatically. Like, I would still be playing the same number of lands. I have the Cantrip Cartel to bail me out, if my hands are like, teetering between the line. Like, I'm not going to, with a deck like Miracles, right, a very reactive, very grindy deck, I'm not going to look at a 7-card hand and then suddenly be like, London Mull, I can do better. I mean, there are certain exceptions, right? So maybe like I will look at a hand that has 2 lands, no cantrips, and a Terminus and be like, I can do better than this. And that's still sort of like a very nuance to the deck. But in general, like my medium or my average hands are going to be good enough. I'm going to try and rather just stick to the old Miracles mantra of building a consistent deck that is, in general, like the opening 7s are good enough that I can leverage my skill to sort of navigate games to a victory.
My point would tie into some stuff that Bryant was talking about in our last discussion when he was bringing up things like Rest in Peace. So I think my deck building I would tweak sideboards to run cards that are sometimes more narrow than I would otherwise run, and run one copy of them, because you are more likely to be able to find these cards in the matchups where they have huge impact than you were before. And sometimes these cards before end up slanting towards being wasted slots, because if you don't see them and they're narrow enough, you add those two factors together, then they're just not worth being a sideboard slot. But a specific card here is Containment Priest and Miracles. I think I'm more likely to run that now in my sideboard than I was before. It's really, to me, the perfect example of a card that benefits from the new Mulligan rule. But I don't have like a one of these land shaving in a combo deck type of scenarios yet. I haven't played as much as these guys, so that's all I got.
Yeah, I mean, the land shaving thing sounds like you have to play TES. You have to play TES to know that it's something that you can afford to do. But I think in general, like, I still want to point out, like, with this whole min-maxing thing, and I'm going to go into another concept here, is that you can't just, there is a cost to mulliganing, right? Like, at the end of the day, you are down a card. And in some situations, decks are designed to mitigate the impact of being down a card by just saying, hey, look, you're dead. Haha, it doesn't matter if you've drawn all the cards in your deck, if you're at 0 life, the game is over, you lose. So that exception aside, I think there's a very principled attribute of Legacy, and that is that all the cards, or a lot of the played cards in Legacy, are very good on like a 1-for-1 basis. And when I say like a 1-for-1, I mean like you have one card and it trades with one resource that your opponent has. Good example is you have play Lightning Bolt, right? It kills Insectile Aberration. It can kill Dark Confidant. It trades 1-for-1 with a creature.
Yeah, but there's some situations where even if your deck often cares about card advantage, the matchup makes it so that your deck doesn't at all. Because sometimes you can trade one card for winning the game. That just goes back to my Containment Priest point. Like, sure, in Miracles, against a lot of decks, you want to be generating card advantage, but you fight on these axes against certain elements of the format where that's just not always the case, in my opinion.
Right. And so I also agree with you. Like, for example, during the London Mull, I actually played Containment Priest for the same reason, right? It's just like you get it in play and you win this matchup that is otherwise very difficult to win because, London Mull makes the matchup much harder or whatever it might be. But what I'm trying to say is just like in general, though, I feel like you can't, let's take like a fair blue matchup. Right, you're playing Delver and I'm playing Miracles. I'm not going to mulligan like a completely reasonable hand just because, for the potential of, something like super busted, right? I'd rather just stick to play this consistent game plan because, if I'm down a card against Delver, that could come and bite me maybe 10 turns into the game where they suddenly have an extra blue card to pitch to their Force Will for like a critical terminus or, example XYZ. I'm saying that card quantity does matter in certain matchups, and the matchups where card quantity doesn't matter, those are usually closer to exceptions rather than the norm. Like, I would even say like a matchup like Miracles versus Storm, card quantity actually does make a big difference because, cards like Duress and Thoughtseize are designed at trading 1-for-1. It's just they sort of skew the 1-for-1 basis, in their favor because Storm only cares about so many specific cards, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really important point, sort of as we start to wind this down to conclude, is that this mulligan rule should not change generally why you're mulliganing or your big picture mulligan strategy. You should not all of a sudden think that you should be aggressively mulling perfectly fine hands in a matchup where, like you said, the number of cards in your hands matters a lot more, like a Delver versus Miracles matchup. It just doesn't have that large of an impact on the game. This is a slight new numbers game we have here in several different scenarios, but mulliganing as a game concept is still working the same. You're going down a card. You just get to see more cards and be hurt less in that way. But you're right.
Whoa, I think Anurag should record that caption.
I know, just have it as my ringtone so I can play it back, or just like, Alexa, play You're Right. Wait a second. Oh God, one sec. Okay. All right. So she had her little spiel, her cameo on the Epic Glory podcast.
The Epic Glory?
Yikes. No, but like,
Wow, oh my goodness. What, you were paid to say that.
is there a lot to unpack here? But yeah, so I think the concept of 1-for-1s means that you can't just freely mulligan, because being down cards there's still a big cost to that. It also goes back to what you're saying, Wilson, is just that people are going to have their interaction more often than not. And if you glass cannon mulligan down to 4 cards to have that turn 1 Gristlebrand, and your opponent has the interaction, right? You just lose on the spot. So you can't afford to just do it all the time. There is a serious cost to mulliganing. And I think this is pretty intuitive. Most people, you know this. I think the London mulligan will mostly be for tweaking those irreparable hands, making when you have to mull, it's not as bad. That's probably my biggest takeaway from what the London mulligan does. And I think at the end of the day, like, that's pretty intuitive, right? I'm not going to say anything groundbreaking here, but like, this is the deep dive into why this is the case. I want to talk about one thing though, regarding deck construction, right? So regarding the homogenization of games, I don't really feel like this is something that we are going to be... I don't think we have to be worried about this too much. And here's my reasoning, right? So yes, we're going to be increasing the consistency of certain decks, especially in the world where you have the Cantrip Cartel and the London Mulligan, where you're more likely to see the same cards over and over again. Yes, people will play the same Ponder on turn 1 hundreds and hundreds of times. But I feel like games are not going to, get to that autopilot level, that Jerry mentioned that he was playing in the show and tell matchups, because that is something you get to capitalize on. You know what I mean? Like, I actually think it makes the meta more interesting, because if people are just going to make the same plays over and over and over again, well, you best believe that, the people at the forefront of the format who are, evolving their decks very, very, speedily, they're going to be able to take advantage of that kind of stuff. And so I think that means that Legacy actually evolves at a faster rate. People will start playing, these more exciting 1-ofs and 2-ofs, like, Containment Priest Wilson, that, I don't know, just Legacy will change. It's not going to be like an easy rock, paper, scissors format, because, Spock is going to enter, Lizard's going to enter the format, and, we have to deal with all that sort of stuff.
So I do think that there's something that maybe wasn't discussed on leaving a Legacy, and it was that Show and Tell isn't a very... trying to be kind with my words here, in-depth deck. It wants to achieve one thing, and it's cast the card Show and Tell. So I can see why Jerry thinks that, hey, maybe this isn't fun. My deck is too good at casting Show and Tell now. And maybe even the same thing could be said for Black Red Reanimator, although I think Black Red Reanimator has a couple more decisions regarding how to put their fatty into play. But
do you really think that?
I kind of do. I mean, you have Faithless Looting and Tomb, then 12 Reanimate effects where Sneak and Show just has Show and Tell and Sneak Attack. Anyway, so you have more lines that way, and like your deck just becomes very good at doing one thing. But if you're playing a deck that isn't just trying to do one thing, sure, your deck is still going to become more efficient at doing that, doing what it wants to do, but it's not going to be at the same rate, and games are still going to be very interesting. But also, Legacy is a format where you're not going to be playing the same decks over and over and over again. At a 15-round event, you might face the same deck twice. You're not going to face Grixis Delver 4 times at a GP. And if you do, it's pretty unlucky. But on average, you might face the same deck twice. So even if you are doing the same thing, like mulliganing into a Show and Tell and casting it on turn 2 5 games in a row, you're doing it against different decks.
Yeah, but I think the point was more that you don't want a matchup to suddenly become formulaic, right? Like, you don't want to be like, oh, I'm playing against Grixis Delver, I guess. Haha, I'm just going to play Show and Tell on turn 2. Haha, it either gets there or it doesn't. That kind of thing, you know what I mean? And I respect that as like a reasonable fear. I just don't think that people are going to be complacent with that happening over and over again. You know what I mean? Like the Deathrite Shaman games where people would go turn 1 Deathrite, turn 2 Pyromancer, like people got sick of it. They complained, and well, the card got banned. I mean, there obviously it's not going to be crying for a banning or anything like that, but like, decks are allowed to evolve. Decks are allowed to grow and respond to the most prominent threat. Like we talked about this last time, where it's just like in September I was playing AKs and predicts, and then in October everyone was playing dredge, and now the format is like it's like rotating pretty rapidly. So that part of that rotation, there is just an inherent you build the cards that will best or give you the best win percentage, and this goes back to the whole min-max thing, right? Like, yes, one thing that I think I saw, the reason Black Red Reanimator didn't completely destroy Legacy during the London Mulled beta period was because people were evolving and adapting. Like playsets of Leyline of the Void were seeing play in almost every single sideboard, even like in Elves. I mean, mostly they were in like Chalice decks, but people came prepared. They had what they wanted. So
I think that's an exaggeration.
I don't know. I saw it a lot.
Did you have 4 in your sideboard?
Silly child. Silly
Woo!
child.
Bring.
Yeah, I kind of think the London Mulligan might promote a very healthy evolution of the format, where that rewards deck building creativity.
While we wind down, I have a question, because we're getting to the end of our show notes. In 1 year, do you think Griselbrand will pay for the sins of the London Mulligan?
Like get banned?
Yes. In 1 year, do you see Griselbrand?
Couldn't you
being
just
illegal?
said that? Couldn't you just been like, do you think?
No, are you kidding me? That was the best way of saying anything on this show
Oh, so you
that has ever been spoken.
so you're romantic too, huh, Wilson? I see it. Hey, you know what? I take it back. I was wrong. You're right. That was beautiful.
I would like that snipped.
I'm going to say that's actually what my wife said tonight. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm going to say that no, Griselbrand will not be banned in 1 year.
Yeah, I'm also gonna echo the same. I just don't. Well, I'm just getting a close-up view of Wilson's head right now, and I don't think I've ever seen that before, Mama. Okay, no, I
It's
also,
not even waxed.
I share the same sentiment. I don't think Griselbrand is going to tear apart the format again. I just think people will respond and react.
I agree, but we are not the majority, I feel like, based on what I've read on Reddit and some of these forums where people think Griselbrand's going to be banned in 2 months because of Black Red Reanimator.
I think this is a good point to make as a conclusion to our show, because my personal thoughts on this is it's very, very cool. Obviously, it changes the game we know and love. It affects it in all the ways we talked about, but err on the side of not assuming that this is not going to do anything insane for Legacy is what I would say. I just don't think it is. I don't think that it's going to have some insane impact. Like all this, there's so much hyperbole going on right now. Griselbrand is going to be banned. All you have to do is mulligan into this turn 1 combo deck. I mean, I'm not running the statistics here, but I can tell you that the math does not work out on the number of extra cards that you see in this new mulligan rule. Doesn't magically allow all of these insane things to suddenly be broken, degenerate, and bannable in the format. I think if anything happens extreme, it is because of people's perception, and they made some sort of big switch, and they decided to go with that, and maybe there's a combo deck that's better than they thought, and they stuck with it, and the metagame changes a little bit forever because of people's perception, or I don't know, but statistically, I just don't see it.
Okay, I like that. That's kind of like a healthy, positive bedtime radio segment, just like broadcasting over the news kind of deal. So yeah, I like that. I think just again, give it time. That's the most important thing, maybe.
And remember, Dreadhorde Arcanus sucks. Everyone, thank you for listening, and have a good night.